Before Rome, before Egypt's pyramids were finished, before anyone had heard the names Caesar or Alexander, there was a flat, muddy land between two rivers. The people who lived there invented things the world had never seen. Cities with walls and streets, temples that scraped the sky writing. Pressed into wet clay they called their land Susa. Across the mountains to the east, another people watched them grow rich behind their canals and city walls. They lived in a harsher landscape of stone and high valleys. They learned to fight, to raid, to survive. They were the Elamites at first. The distance between them was just geography, lowlands versus highlands, clay versus rock. But as Sumer's cities grew fatter and brighter, that distance turned into something else, a frontier between the first city-states in history and the people who were willing to burn them. Around 2700 BC, long before world wars or empires on 3 continents, Sumer and Elam fought one of the earliest recorded wars in human history, a conflict so old that most of it has vanished, leaving only a handful of broken tablets and a single chilling line. He carried away as spoils the weapons of Elam. This is the story of the Sumerian Elamite conflicts, when war meant burning the first cities humanity ever built, when the idea of conquest was new, when every battle wrote the rules for what war would become. Before there were empires, there were cities. Not Rome, not Babylon, older on the flat, shimmering plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Mud brick rose out of the floodplains and became walls. Walls became districts. Districts became your Uruk, Lagash, Kish, clusters of temples and houses, smoke and markets, all circling a single idea. We are the center of the world. The gods live here. Across the horizon to the east, beyond the open fields and into the low mountains, another world watched them, the valleys and plateaus of what is now southwestern Iran. Villages hardened into their own strongholds. Brick and stone gathered into cities like Susa, under a name that would one day make the cities of Sumer whisper Elam. For a time, the story was simple. Sumer grew, Elam grew. Caravans moved between them with wood from the highland stone and metal from the east grain. Cloth and crafted goods from the great cities of the plain trade routes stitched the two worlds together like a scar across the borderlands. But walls do something to the human mind. They don't just keep things out. They teach people to look out at others and think, them, us. In the cool shadows of Uruk's temples, priests measured out offerings and scribes pressed symbols into wet clay records of barley, sheep, and tribute. In Kish, kings began to claim titles bigger than their own walls, calling themselves King of Kish, King of the land, as if all Sumer should kneel. And in Susa, Elamite rulers did their own counting. They saw caravans flowing west. They heard of Sumerian kings boasting that their power reached the mountains where the sun rises. They watched merchants grow rich selling what Elam pulled from its earth. At some point, someone on one side of that invisible line decided, why just trade with the first cities, when we can plunder them? The first war between Sumer and Elam, the first war we can glimpse not as myth but as history, does not open with a grand alliance or a formal declaration. It begins with a march. Somewhere around 2700 BC, a Sumerian king from Kish, later tradition calls him, and Meberra Jasi leads his men east. They do not carry maps, they carry standards and spears, following the tracks that caravans take toward Elam. Clay tablets will later claim he subdued Elam. We don't have his battle report or his casualty lists. We have something stranger, a broken stone vessel with his name scratched into it, found far from home. A king list that gives him an impossible reign of hundreds of years, wrapping a real man in legendary fog. Behind the exaggeration, one thing stands. Sumerian soldiers crossed the border. Elam remembered. If the first blow came from the west, the answer came from the east. Within a century or so, the pattern reverses. Elamite armies come storming down from the highlands and onto the alluvial plain. They don't stop at farms, they go for the cities themselves. An early dynasty of Elam, later called A1, pushes into Sumer, and one day an Elamite force does something almost unthinkable to the proud southern cities. It topples a Sumerian ruling house and ends the first dynasty of Ur. One side burns a border city. The other side answers by dragging off a king in chains. Step by step, raid by raid, the relationship between Sumer and Elam stops being trading partners who sometimes fight, and becomes something colder, a long feud between two worlds facing each other over a line drawn in mud and blood. The thing to remember is this: none of these kings think of themselves as small. The ruler of Lagash looks out over his irrigation canals and temple courts and sees a universe centered on his ziggurat. The ruler of Ur looks down from his palace and sees ships in his harbor, loaded with goods from lands he's never walked, and thinks, if the gods favor me, the gods favor this city. To the east, kings in Susa and the Elamite highlands do the same. Each city believes the gods live in their own temples, speak their own language, bless their own banners. So when a Sumerian army marches into Elam and writes victory on clay, and when an Elamite army storms into Sumer and drags back statues and prisoners, they're not just stealing wealth, they're saying, your city, your god, your name, all of it can be taken. What makes these wars different from the older, half-mythic raids sung about in taverns is not just scale, it's memory. By now, the cities of Sumer have developed something new, writing sophisticated enough to record not just shipments and offerings, but campaigns. Monuments steely of stone that can be set up in temple courtyards, showing kings trampling their enemies underfoot. When a city like Lagash goes to war against a rival like Umma, they carve the triumph onto the stele of the vultures, lines of infantry marching in formation, nets full of captured enemies, birds feasting on corpses. When enemies from Elam push in from the east, seize cities, and haul off loot to Susa, the proof piles up in their own capital Sumerian tablets and statues, ripped from temples and dragged over the mountains. Centuries later, archaeologists will find them there, silent witnesses to raids no poet survived to describe. The world has reached a new phase. War doesn't just kill, it writes, it leaves. Boundary stones, boastful inscriptions, lists of captured kings and plunder. Thanks to that, we can see the outline of something that once shook the first cities, a long, uneven series of clashes in which Sumer and Elam take turns invading, burning and boasting. Two landscapes, two memories, one shared habit. When times grow hard and borders feel tight, look at the city beyond the horizon and think, if I can take it, I should. By the time this first chapter of their hatred is over, nothing is the same. Ur and Lagash have learned that their walls are not invincible. Susa has learned that the riches of Mesopotamia can be carried back east in wagon loads. The space between them has become a permanent frontier, a zone of forts, outposts, and scarred ground. The story of the Sumerian Elamite wars is not one clean campaign with a neat ending. It's a rhythm. Sumer marches east, Elam marches west. Cities burn, kings boast, the tablets pile up. And behind every broken wall and toppled idol, one question grows sharper. In a world where every city believes it was chosen by the gods, what happens when the gods seem to favor your enemy? That question is where the next chapter begins. War between Sumer and Elam doesn't start with foreigners. It starts with neighbors. Before Elamite armies come roaring out of the east, the cities of Sumer are already tearing at each other like angry brothers. And to understand why Sumer and Elam fight, you first have to see how Sumerians learned to hate. Sumerians, the field no one wanted to share. Between the cities of Lagash and Umma lies something that does not look like destiny. It is just land, a strip of fertile ground cut by irrigation canals, sprinkled with boundary markers and shrines. Not a fortress, not a temple, just fields. But in a world where grain means survival and every city believes the gods gave them the best land, that field becomes a fuse. Lagash claims it. Umma claims it. Priests swear that their city's god Ninjasu in Lagash. Shara in Umma owns the soil, the water, the harvest. Scribes draw up agreements, carve boundary stones, swear oaths in the name of heaven. It doesn't hold. Year after year, when times are hard, men from Umma quietly move the Motka stones, push their plows a little farther into what Lagash considers sacred ground. Border guards send angry reports. Farmers complain. Tempers rise. Eventually, one king of Lagash decides that words and stones aren't enough. He marches. Lagash goes to war. We know his name. Inatum, ruler of Lagash. We don't have his war journal. We have something better for our purpose, a monument his masons raise after the campaign. A tall stone slab carved with scenes of battle and crows feasting on the dead. Later generations will call it the stele of the vultures. On one side, soldiers of Lagash march in tight formation, shields locked, spears leveled, eyes fixed forward. They are not a mob, they are a line, drilled and disciplined, advancing as one. Behind them strides Inatum himself, larger than life, trampling enemies underfoot as if he were a god of war. On the other side of the stone, vultures carry off dismembered heads and limbs, a crude but effective way of saying, this is what happens when you cross our boundary. Inatum beats Umma. He forces their ruler to swear new oaths, to pay tribute, to accept the border as Lagash defines it. For a moment, the world seems simple again. The gods of Lagash have proved they are stronger. The line in the dust has been defended with blood. The field is secure. But the stone tells us something else, too, something Inatum might not have intended. War is becoming systematic. Soldiers in formation, clearly marked borders, written treaties, monumental propaganda. In other words, cities have learned how to turn organized violence into a political tool. And Elam is watching. The sound of opportunity to the east, in the highlands and valleys. Rulers in Susa and other Elamite centers hear the news. Lagash and Umma at each other's throats. Kish and Uruk vying for prestige. City after city pouring men, bronze and grain into local feuds. When the great cities of the plain are busy fighting each other, they are not watching the borderlands. Caravans still move. Donkeys still carry grain, wool, beer, metal, ingots, carved goods. But the roads are thinner with guards, the outposts distracted, garrisons under strength. For a clever Elamite ruler, this sounds less like danger and more like invitation. At first, the moves are small. A raid on a frontier town, a caravan attacked and stripped, a minor shrine looted and burned. Sumerian kings respond with their own raids, their own boasts. Clay tablets record that they subdued Elam, struck Elam, brought Elam low. But these victories never last. The truth is harsher. Neither side can crush the other completely. Both sides can hurt each other badly enough to remember. War becomes a message. Sumerian kings are not content just to win. They want the world to see that they won. So they carve their victories into steel, dedicate enemy weapons to their gods, drag defeated rulers back to their cities as symbols of divine favor. Elamite kings do the same in reverse. When they raid Sumerian cities, they don't just take gold and grain. They take statues of gods, carried off from temples, inscribed tablets, written in Sumerian, hauled back to Susa as trophies, boundary monuments, uprooted and replanted in foreign soil. Imagine being a citizen of your Lagash and hearing that your city, Akkad, a carved statue that you believe houses the divine presence, has been taken east, displayed in a foreign temple, made to bow to an alien deity. It isn't just defeat. It feels like cosmic humiliation. Scribes respond by writing curses. Whoever moves this stone, whoever breaks this treaty, may the gods erase his name, his children, his city. Over and over, the tablets repeat the same pattern. We marked a border. They violated it. We punished them. May the gods punish any who do this again. But again keeps coming. The frontier hardens. Every time a Sumerian king marches east and claims victory, he strengthens one part of the story. We are strong. We are favored. We have pushed back Elam. Every time an Elamite force comes west and tears a city's statues from its temples, they strengthen another part. They are not invincible. Their gods abandon them where can hurt them. The land between them stops being just open space. It becomes a permanent scar. Fortified towns changing hands, checkpoints where caravans are taxed or robbed, patches of burned fields where no one is sure whose laws apply for the ordinary farmer. It means uncertainty. One year he pays taxes to Lagash. Next year Elamite soldiers come and demand grain for Susa. The year after that, a different Sumerian city arrives, claiming the land in the name of its own god. For the kings and priests, it means something more. War is no longer just about survival. It's about identity, who we are, where our god rules, which side of the line we stand on. Once that idea takes root, conflict with the people beyond the line stops being an accident. It becomes a habit. By the time Sumer begins to unify under stronger rulers, and new powers like Akkad rise in the north, the pattern is set. City-states don't just raid, they claim borders. Borders don't just mark land, they mark who belongs. War doesn't just punish. It sends a message carved in stone and clay. And whenever Sumer looks east across that border, it does not see trading partners anymore. It sees Elam, a rival, a mirror, a reminder that the first cities humanity ever built were not just capable of worship and law. They were capable of remembering grudges for centuries. For generations, the wars between Sumer and Elam were local storms. A city here, a raid there, a boundary stone moved, a temple burned, a king dragged away in chains. The landscape was a patchwork of powers: Uruk, Lagash, Kish in the plains, Elamite centers like Susa in the hills. No one held everything. No one dared to dream that big, until a man from a city called Akkad decided that the map was too small. His name would echo for thousands of years. Sargon, from cupbearer to king, he does not start as a god king. Later legends say he was a nobody, a man of humble birth, set adrift in a basket on a river, raised by a gardener. Stories that sound suspiciously like later royal myths. What we know is simpler and more dangerous. Sargon serves a king of Kish as a cupbearer close enough to power to watch it, measure it, and envy it. At some point, he turns from servant to rival. When the dust settles, Kish is his, and Sargon begins to move. He does not want one city. He wants all of Sumer. One by one, he breaks the proud southern cities Uruk, where kings once boasted they ruled over all lands. You're rich with trade and temples. Lagash, hardened by its own wars. On clay tablets, scribes press new titles after his name: King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Four Quarters. For the first time, the squabbling city-states are pulled violently under a single crown. The plains that once hosted dozens of rival banners now see one standard more and more: Akkad. But Sargon is not finished. When he looks east toward Elam, he does not see a distant power to respect. He sees the next step, the first push east somewhere in the years of his long reign. Sargon marches his armies across the old frontier, into the lands that earlier kings had only raided. Sumerian cities had always talked about subduing Elam, but their control flickered. They would win a battle, brag on stone, and then lose their grip again when a rival city attacked them from behind. Sargon brings something new, a standing army, not just farmers called up for a season. A central administration spreading his authority over conquered cities, a vision that the lands beyond the border are not just targets for plunder, but provinces to be held. When his scribes write of campaigns, Elam appears not as a mysterious distant land, but as another region to be brought under the yoke. In Elam, this does not go unnoticed. To Sumer and Akkad, the highlands to the east are now a place where rebellion must be crushed. To Elam, the plains to the west have become a place where foreign rulers now claim to speak for the gods. The old rivalry between city and city is mutating into something larger. Imperial control from Akkad, regional resistance from the highlands and borderlands. The frontier that once belonged to many small kings now exists in the shadow of one very large one. Storm after the founder, no human reign lasts forever. After Sargon's death, his successors inherit a kingdom stretched thin, too many conquered cities, too many resentful local elites, too many fronts to hold at once. His grandson Naram-Sin pushes the idea of divine kingship even further. He calls himself god of Akkad and carves reliefs showing himself trampling mountain enemies, wearing a horned crown reserved for deities. He, too, fights in the east. Elam, mountain tribes, highland cities, the lands beyond the plains become a field of constant struggle as Akkadian armies try to keep the world from dissolving back into its old patchwork. Each victory brings new titles. Each campaign brings new resentments. And somewhere in the pressure of this stretched empire, the seeds of collapse are planted. When Had finally falls under the combined weight of internal revolts, climate stress, and invading groups like the Guchans, the shockwave rolls across both Sumer and Elam. The great unifier is gone. The map shatters again. New kings rise from old cities. In Sumer, a dynasty in Uruk called Ur III tries to restore order and build something like the old glory. This time with better administration and harder lessons learned. In Elam, local powers regroup around Susa and other centers, remembering every time a Western empire has marched into their valleys. The rivalry is not over. It has simply moved into a new phase. A rival in every victory. Here is the cruel truth of this age. Every time one side believes it has finally solved the problem of the other, it is only setting up the next round of the feud. Sargon thinks that conquering Sumer and pushing into Elam will stabilize the east. It doesn't. It teaches Elam exactly how dangerous a unified Mesopotamia can be. Later, kings of Ur III think that tight control and bureaucracy will prevent chaos. It doesn't. It makes rebellion, when it comes, even more explosive. On both sides of the old border, rulers begin to understand something ugly. If we do not hurt them first, they will one day be strong enough to hurt us. This logic will eventually lead to one of the most symbolic acts in the entire Sumerian Elamite story, the day when Elamite forces march into Ur itself, and the king who thought he ruled a reborn golden age finds himself dragged away, his city burning behind him. The city that once dreamed of organizing the world will taste what it has so often inflicted on others. But that is another chapter. For now, what matters is this: the old world of many equal cities is gone. The new world of empires and counter-empires is beginning. And the long feud between Sumer and Elam has been woven into something bigger than either of them. When Sargon of Akkad dies, his empire fractures, but the idea he unleashed, that one man, one center, can claim everything, will haunt both horizons. The plains of Sumer, where cities still pray to ancient gods in ancient temples. The highlands of Elam, where rulers are learning that the best defense against a conqueror from the west might one day be to strike first, with fire. The next time the frontier explodes, it will not just be a raid. It will be the fall of a world. For a brief moment in time, it looked like Sumer had learned its lesson. After the chaos that followed the fall of Akkad, a new dynasty rose in the city of Uruk, what later scribes would call the time of Ur III, to its kings. It was not Ur III, it was simply the world put back in order, the dream of a perfect state. From their terraces and palaces, kings like Shulgi look out over a land they claim to have tamed. Canals restored, temples rebuilt, roads patrolled, taxes counted to the last measure of grain. Scribes multiply like ants in the sun, pressing lines of wedge-shaped script into tablets that record everything: who harvested what, who paid which tax, who served in which labor gang, which offerings went to which god. On those tablets, the kings of Ur call themselves kings of Sumer and Akkad, kings of the four quarters. They fortify cities, build royal highways, post garrisons deep into the old frontier zones toward Elam. They marry diplomacy and force, sending daughters as brides, gifts as bribes, threats as reminders. On the surface, it looks like stability. Underneath, pressure builds. Cracks in the golden mask. The problem with a finely tuned system is simple. It works until it doesn't. A bad harvest here, a flood that breaks a canal there. Nomadic groups pressing on the edges. Local officials skimming off more than they send back to Ur. The king's hand grows heavier. More forced labor, heavier levies, harsher punishments for anyone who slips. People still bow in the temples and scribes still write praises, but in the villages and border towns, faith begins to wear thin. To the east, in the lands of Elam and its neighbors, rulers are watching. They remember Akkad, they remember Sargon, they remember every time a Western empire has marched into their valleys. And they see something very familiar happening again: a center growing rich and overconfident, a periphery growing angry and poor. The smell of weakness as the reign of the last kings of Ur III wears on. The world stops fearing them quite so much. Enemies test the edges, raids on outposts, caravans robbed, local rulers delaying tribute, just to see what happens. Inside the empire, some cities begin to think the unthinkable. Maybe Ur is not forever. And in the east, Elam sees its chance. This time, the kings of Elam are not content with a harassment raid or a symbolic border clash. This is not about a single field, a single town, or a single boundary stone. They aim for the heart. They aim for your. History doesn't stop when a city burns, it scatters. People from Ur flee to other towns. Scribes find work in new courts. Rebels in one place become advisors in another. The names change, the pattern doesn't. The fate of names over the centuries that follow. The old independent Sumerian cities lose their unique political voices. New powers rise: Babylon in the plains, different dynasties in Elam. The languages shift, the gods change shape and titles. But deep under the changes, the memory of that long rivalry stays. Stories of kings from the plain invading the east. Stories of warriors from the mountains burning the cities of the rivers. Tales of statues taken, borders redrawn, treaties broken. Eventually, when later empires write about their own struggles, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, they walk over ground already marked by older scars. What these wars invented, the Sumerian Elamite conflicts, are not world wars in our sense, they are border wars. But in them we see some of the first clear examples of things that will define conflict for thousands of years. City-state identity. We are this city, with this god, this tradition. Sacred borders, lines in the dust that become lines worth dying for. Total humiliation of enemies, not just defeating armies but tearing down their temples and kidnapping their gods. Propaganda carved in stone and clay, wars turned into stories, monuments, victory lists, curses and laments. Every time a king inscribes, "I captured their king, I smashed their city, I erased their name," he is teaching the world a new lesson. War is not just about who lives and who dies, it's about who gets to tell the story. The first shadow of the other side between Sumer and Elam, something else is born. The idea of a permanent opposite. We who live here on the flatlands between the rivers. They who live there in the highlands beyond. Neither side sees the other as a blank. They see a familiar enemy. You trade with them when it suits you. You raid them when you can. You fear them when they grow too strong. You celebrate when their god statues decorate your temple. That rhythm of economic need, cultural exchange, and armed hatred will repeat in different forms. Greeks and Persians, Rome and Parthia, city and steppe, core and frontier. But one of the earliest, clearest prototypes of that dynamic sits right here, in the wars between the first cities and their eastern neighbors. What the tablets remember today, the plains of ancient Sumer, are fields and ruins. The old walls of your Lagash and Kish are broken lines in the earth. Elamite centers like Susa have been rebuilt, erased, rebuilt again. But in museums and archives, the clay tablets and broken stones from those centuries still speak. They tell us of kings who boasted they had subdued Elam once and for all, of Elamite rulers who dragged those kings away and took their gods, of canals that ran red, streets choked with dust and ash, people asking why their gods had abandoned their cities. And in those fragments, we see something uncomfortable. The very first cities humanity ever built did not simply create law, writing, and religion. They created soldiers and formation, borders that cut the world into us and them, wars that could be recorded, replayed and glorified. When Sumer and Elam fought, they weren't just burning each other's homes. They were giving future ages a template. This is how you fight when your world is made of cities and gods. This is how you make war when you know how to write it down. And that is why, even when their names faded from most memories, their wars still matter. They were the first time humanity looked at the work of its own hands. Cities, temples, kingships, and decided, we built this, we can burn it too.